So this is big news, but not in the good way, because this news article released that there was app key leaks for Laravel applications, 600 vulnerable applications using 260,000 exposed keys from GitHub. So yeah, that's not good news, but just how bad are these leaks? What happened? And then what can we do about it? Why don't we talk? But hey, sadly, no one has leaked their Stripe API keys to me in support of this channel. So instead, we're going to turn to a sponsor. So here's the sponsor for today's video.
All right, and send. Perfect. All right, user number 6 just signed up. Hey Siri, set a timer for 10 minutes. We need to get this drip campaign out the door for new sign up. Hey, what are you doing? Who else is gonna send these emails? Every single minute I need to watch to make sure my users are signed up so that I can get them emails as promptly as possible. So I got timers.
I could just use Bento. They have workflows and triggers specifically meant for those kind of automations.
Yeah, that sounds better.
Seriously, Bento is fantastic, even if you only use a small part of it like I do. My favorite feature, being able to automate my email flows, saying once something happens in my code, and of course there's SDKs for literally everything, I can say I want to wait a certain number of time and then I want to send or this email or start this campaign. It just makes the things I want to do within my application easier, and it makes it better for my users because I don't have to bother them as much as I would otherwise, because all the automation's built in and flexible for my use cases. So seriously, try Bento, let them know Josh Siri sent you, and get started with it today. So if you've seen anything on either X or Twitter about these two big articles, one from getguardian.com and then one from thehackernews.com, not to be confused with hackernews.com, about these exploited public app key leaks, hundreds of Laravel applications. And what they say is there's 600 vulnerable applications that have been using 260,000 exposed keys from GitHub. And now these numbers are a little skewed because it doesn't necessarily mean that there are 260,000 applications that are vulnerable right now. There are 600. But over 260,000 exposed keys from GitHub. And even that number is a little bit misleading, and we'll get into why. So before we dive into what exactly happened, it's important to know what is an app key within Laravel. So Laravel has an encryption service that provides this simple, convenient interface for encrypting and decrypting text via OpenSSL using AES 256, AES 128 encryption. So everything that goes through a Laravel application is first passed through this encryption key, an app key, so that all of your sessions, all of your cookies, all of your data can't be modified or tampered once this encryption key has been set, because it has to be a match that particular encryption key. So this is key to note, and not in a pun kind of way. This app key has been set, and so then any sort of configuration, any sort of cookies, any sort of sessions that are set within your application are then encrypted through this app key, this environment variable that you put into your application that's usually generated upon when you first create this Laravel application or when you first deploy it to your server. But that key can be rotated. So what happened with these leaks when it comes to this app key? And what does it mean for people who their app keys were leaked? Was this user error? Was this something else? Let's see. So this blog mentions what the Laravel docs kind of mentions is that this app key, it's a randomly generated 32-byte symmetric encryption key, and Laravel that by default uses byte 64 in order to do that, or base 64, I should say. And it's automatically utilized by this encrypt and decrypt functions so that you don't have to have explicit developer intervention. If attackers obtain the app key and can invoke the decrypt function, that is key in this particular instance. With a maliciously crafted payload, they can achieve remote code execution on the Laravel web server, so they can make some nasty things happen. It goes on to say it's not far from being theoretical, but it does pose a real threat for several critical reasons. I'm not going to read the whole article. It's good to know that this is not a Laravel problem. This is a user problem, but it is good to be aware of why some users might make this mistake, and then what you can be what you can make sure you don't do in the future. And while I do have a qualm with how some of these numbers have been presented, because for the most part, those 260,000 leaked app keys are probably not ever or were ever in production, but there are those 600 Laravel applications that were compromised. And so that is good to note. But this article dives into the process of what it would look like for this compromised app key in order to validate it, to decrypt it, and then send some remote code execution along with that decrypt function. And so it's good to know that that decryption has to succeed. Just knowing the app key is not necessarily good enough. This author explains that at GitGuardian, they've been monitoring GitHub activity in real time since 2018 and would likely have access to numerous exposed app keys. And so those would be app keys that have been pushed to GitHub specifically in public repos. Our collaboration started right away, and we defined patterns that allowed me, the author, to crunch data and finally extract 260,000 app keys. Again, not all in production app keys, but here, this extended data set helped Remy and Mikkel to extend their result to 600 trivially compromised Laravel applications. That's the big number right here. Those were app keys that were found on public GitHub repos that then were able to be compromised because they were in production application keys. But like this article says, that analysis was just the beginning to reveal the full scope of the problem, because it really comes down to a user error or just a misunderstanding of how the app key works, how secret it should be because of how the Laravel application decrypts and encrypts specific sessions and what is possible when you know that app key, especially from malicious users. And here's the second thing that most malicious users would need within a Laravel application, not just the app key pushed into a Git repo, because for the most part, you probably don't know where that production application lives, and even in order to even test if that application key is active. But the collaboration with Synactive not only expanded the scale of vulnerable applications, but also revealed new attacked vectors. During the app key extraction process, it became apparent that many developers were inadvertently exposing the app URL alongside their app key. So the app URL configuration defines the application's base URL, which Laravel uses to generate absolute links and asset URLs. And so if you have both the app URL and app key, it creates a powerful attack vector. Attackers can directly access the target application, retrieve session cookies, and attempt to decrypt them using the exposed key. And I do want to make note of this particular sentence: attempt to decrypt them using the exposed key. While we'll get into why it is very bad to have your app key, especially for a production application, out there exposed for everyone to see, you still do have to have a way to decrypt that application key in order for that potentially malicious attack to occur. So what happens when you do have an app key that is either leaked or compromised? Well, don't do what these particular GitHub repositories did, or what this author claims. The developers discovered their exposure, but chose to simply remove the commits rather than properly rotating the compromised keys. And there's a blog article that goes into this, but I want to first take a look at what does a from scratch Laravel application look like, and then what were some of these changes that these developers and you can potentially not make so that you don't have something like this happen to you. So if we were to pull up our terminal and we were to just run Laravel new app key gen, I'll just use a blank Livewire application. What happens within Git? And that's the big key here, because you don't want to expose your app key. Now, of course, you have an application. We see this here, application key set successfully. Laravel has a PHP artisan command that is PHP artisan key generate that allows you to then generate this base 64 key for your application to use when it decrypts any information in order to set session, cookies, etc. within your Laravel application. So we have our .env and we have this app key right here. Of course, this is my development environment. Usually when I'll push this to, let's say Laravel Cloud, or if I'm running on a server, most of the time you're going to run the artisan key generate command, or have a particular key that you've already generated that you would put in your environment variables. If there's no key generated, then it's not going to work. Your application is not going to work. There is nothing to decrypt it against. So do we have a git ignore? And by default, at least on this version of Laravel, Laravel 12, and for most versions of Laravel in the past recent years, you do have a .git ignore that includes any env files. So you have to be very specific in order to leak your .env key that includes an app key. Now, here's what most people do that is wrong, even with other environment variables. Let's say you had like an OpenAI API key, and you had also a Stripe key. Now, most of the time, especially if you're working within a team, the tendency is to then, I'm just going to copy these and put them in the .env.example so that whenever my team clones this repo, downloads it to their local environment, and then runs it there, okay, you already have your API keys set. But even if this is a private repo, this is still a bad practice. This is something that you shouldn't do because it's not the best case scenario. That is what encrypted messaging is for. So whether that is just encrypted messaging between you and your team, that's using something like 1Password or Doppler to send those specific API keys. Now, if those are just testing API keys, and it's not as bad, of course, that's kind of up to you when that comes, or if you're just frequently rotating those testing keys as well. But for the most part, you probably shouldn't put anything in this .env.example or anything that is going to be hosted on Git. So what happens when this does happen? Well, if we were to pull up in our code, we have this PHP artisan key generate command. We can also pass in the -- show parameter. So this is going to generate a new base64 32 character string. And that is what Laravel needs in order for that app key to be a true app key. So I could just take this, put it in my .env file on my server, and now that app key is rotated. Of course, now your sessions are going to be changed. If you have users logged in, they're not going to be logged in anymore. They're going to have to be logged in again. And so that is why Laravel, now in this case, for example, this is not something you should do if your app key is exposed, but you do have the ability to then gracefully rotate encryption keys, because it's a good idea, especially if you have a high profile Laravel application. It's a good idea to rotate your encryption keys. You can put your previous key in your environment variable. Again, this is on the server, so that it's going to try the app key first. And if it doesn't work that way, it's going to grab the previous key to try to decrypt those variables from that user session or cookies, and then update them to the new encrypted variable sessions. This is a way to gracefully change your keys, because that is a good practice. It wasn't just app key, and really that's what this all comes down to, right? The ability as a user to know what should be secret and what is okay to have saved for .env.example, where you're saying, okay, this is production info, but it's just maybe, it's okay for it to be saved as a .env.example. It's not necessarily a secret in that sense. And of course, there are good ways to make things secret that should be secret. But if this is something like an app key or API keys or anything that is remotely able to be used in a malicious manner, that should be something that is then never shown to someone. And even for the most part within your team, you probably don't need to have your team have these variables as well. That should be kept in like a secret manager place, or within your CI/CD, or anything else remotely related to that. But if it's just for, hey, you can get this application up and running on your environment, that's what something like 1Password or again Doppler or anything related to that, where you can kind of share environment variables like that, would be perfect for. And again, this article calls out Laravel applications, but even in this analysis of file names where it's like these app keys, it revealed that 63% originate from .env files or variants such as .env.production. This indicates that exposures typically occur in configuration files containing diverse application secrets, not exclusively Laravel credentials. So again, not just not just app keys, but also something like API key or database credentials, God forbid. And yeah, it goes into mention database credentials and cloud storage tokens. Additional exposure credentials frequently include e-commerce platforms, customer support systems. All of these things are being stored in plain text within a .env blank or just a .env. That again is not just stored there. It's fine if it's stored locally, especially if you're using that to then push to production straight into your SSHing or something like that. But for the most part, everything should be kept as secret as possible. And that includes not being just stored locally on your machine, even if you're a solo developer. One thing I couldn't quite figure out what they were mentioning in this article is they mentioned at the top there was 600 vulnerable applications using 260,000 exposed keys. But then this frequently asked question is what's the scale of Laravel app key exposure? And it would be 400 app keys as functional with 4 confirmed cases of trivial remote code execution. So I don't know where that 200 additional came from. Maybe that's just they were functional at some point, and maybe this 400 is more up to date in that sense. Like this frequently asked question says, if something is compromised, definitely rotate it. But how do you keep this from happening in the future? Well, one, I guess just don't add these to your Git repository, first of all, or don't share them publicly in any way. But then two, use the features that Laravel provides. So not just gracefully rotating, which is a good idea, but you also have Laravel encrypted environment variables. Now, what does this mean? Just like we've said before, unencrypted environment variables or files should never be stored in source control. However, Laravel allows you to encrypt your environment files so that they may be safely added to source control with the rest of your application. This is a great way to share environment variables with the rest of your team. How do you do that? PHP Artisan env encrypt. Why don't we take a look? So if I was to say, hey, I have these sensitive information now, OpenAI API key. I have, I have my database credentials, even just for my staging or testing environment. I have mail keys. I have whatever, fill in the blank of what secrets you usually have in most of your applications. Then you can run PHP Artisan env encrypt. And so this gives you the option of either generate a random encryption key or providing an encryption key. I'm going to generate one. And here's the key, the cipher, and then the encrypted file. So now I have this encrypted file. Let's see what we need to do with it. And the key here is that decryption key. Now this is just as sensitive and just as secret, if not more so, than your API key or your app key if it's for a production environment, because this is what you would need to then keep in a password manager or something like that you can securely share with your team. Or if this is a production environment, make sure that it exists only on your server and not anywhere within a local environment, for example. So let's say I have that. Anytime let's say I could push this into my Git repo because this is encrypted now. And now let's say I'm moving to a different workstation. I'm having my team use this information and they need this particular info. Then I can use PHP Artisan env decrypt, where I can paste in that decryption key. And in this case, the environment file already exists. But if for some reason it didn't, in this case, we're going to delete that .env and I run this again. Then all of a sudden that decrypted file now becomes available to me at my workstation. I don't have to then make sure that I have all of the variables kind of in place. It just exists within that one decryption key. Security, especially within an application, is nothing to take lightly. So it's not something that you should just be like, hey, this isn't a big production application, so I don't really care if my API keys are even in a private repo, or public repo is even worse, but hopefully you are a little bit smarter than that. But the goal is that you can use the tools, the things that Laravel gives out of the box to say, hey, you can rotate your keys and do it gracefully so that there's no session mishaps and users logged out when you don't want them to. You can decrypt and encrypt your environment variables so that you can safely push them to a Git repo and have those available to you as long as you are storing your encrypted environment key in a secure place. Being smart with how you build your application and how you store your application, how you push it to GitHub, is being a responsible developer. It's just as important as something like authorization. I even have a video up here that you can find about how you can use authorization within a Livewire application to make sure your users are not seeing something that they shouldn't be seeing. But it comes down to being smart as a user, being smart as a developer, and not just thinking, someone else is not going to do this. They're not going to be bad. Everyone on the internet is bad. They are going to make bad choices. They are going to make bad mistakes. They are going to do things badly to your application. So guard against that. But until next time, keep creating.